I was a member of the Sullivanians from 1973 to 1979. My involvement inextricably altered my life, and this hour-and-a-half podcast tells the events of my life and chronicles my involvement and the aftermath. The collapse of the group has been documented before in several news and magazine articles, a dissertation, and most recently a book, but never a first-person accounting, and this is what you will hear on this podcast. An artist since I was a child, later earning a master's from Brooklyn College with a passion for writing poetry. The genesis of this podcast began over 10 years ago when I wrote a memoir. Years passed as I tried to shop the book, but couldn't find neither an agent nor a publisher. The book languished on my computer, and then, with the advent of iMovie, I used my memoir as the scaffolding for a documentary that became an official selection of New Filmmakers New York 2020 and a Spotlight Documentary Bronze Award winner 2020 for artistic merit. When this creative journey began, the Sullivanians were largely forgotten, except perhaps by the several hundred former members, 500 at its zenith, many of whom, like myself, survived the control wrought by the Institute and therapists that 40 years later still resonate and begs to be heard. The full documentary can be seen on my YouTube channel, Shell Fine One. Thank you. I loved my mother, but living together was like the two of us in a pocket, our only privacy, our secrets. She was dating again, and there were nights I'd come home late to the stale smell of sex and alcohol. After Sheila's wedding, the living arrangements changed. My mother moved from the couch to Sheila's bed, not an arm's length away from mine, and the discordant sound of her snoring filled the room like the telltale heart. Sleep was impossible. After 5 years, I was ready to move out, but my mother took my mention of this as rejection, and then I met Greg. I'd enrolled at Queens College. Their art program was considered the best in the CUNY system. Mr. Bellafini's survey of 20th century art was a required class. It was one of those anonymous lecture classes where the slides whizzed by on a 20-foot-high glowing screen, accompanied by the professor's disembodied voice. When the last slide disappeared from view, most students were up and out of their seats before the lights came up, pushing through the doors of Kiley Auditorium like pent-up cattle. I was taking my time, however, deep in thought, when a decidedly husky voice interrupted my reverie. "Excuse me." "Shit, you scared me," I said, turning around. "You shouldn't sneak up on a girl like that." He smiled, setting off a dimple in his chin, and I noticed his good looks. "Sorry, I just wanted to ask you a favor. I missed the lecture last week, and I was wondering if you could borrow my notes," I said, finishing his question. "Well, close. I was hoping if you were free now, we could go over to Bop's library, and I could Xerox them right now." He seemed overeager but harmless. "Well, okay, if we do it fast. I'm hungry. So what's your name?" His name was Greg Hoffman, and after he reached for a fishing tackle box covered in as much paint as his clothes, I found out that he was a sophomore in the visual arts program. After Xeroxing my notes, and with traces of summer still lingering in the deep shadows of the bucolic Queens campus, Greg led the way toward the southern end of the great lawn, where we ate our sandwiches in companionable silence. When he finished, he pulled a small sketch pad from his knapsack and asked, "Do you mind?" When he'd finished, I was relieved to see he wasn't playing at being an artist. "This is very good," I said. I like your use of negative space." He grinned from ear to ear at that, and I asked, "So, How do your parents deal with you being an artist? My mother keeps telling me artists don't make any money and I need something else to fall back on. That's her favorite phrase, fall back on. Like anyone wants to fall back from doing what they want to be doing in the first place. She says she doesn't know where I get the bug from to paint, as though I've been bitten by some exotic insect. He laughed at that. What does your father say? He asked, making adjustments to the drawing. My parents divorced when I was 2, and he's been out of the picture for a very long time. I only have my mother to deal with, and that's enough. Well, my father thinks all artists are faggots. His words, not mine. He wants me to follow in his footsteps and be a butcher. And my mother thinks whatever my father tells her to think. He's a prick and a bully. I'm trying to save enough money driving a taxi to get an apartment share, but right now I stay in my room out of his way. I share a room with my mother, and so I have nowhere to hide, and she acts like I'm going to be living there forever. And when she drinks, I can't talk to her at all. I think she's never really recovered from my grandfather's death, but at least she's not a bigot. Greg and I remained friends, even though he continued to ask me out, giving me flowers and silly presents like a tiny puff-cheeked troll doll, with a note tucked into a shock of wild pink hair that read, "Won't you change your mind?" I wanted to say yes. I hadn't dated anyone since Tommy, but I was like a little girl stubbornly digging her toe in the dirt, unable to stop herself from saying no. But he was relentless, and right before intercession and Christmas break, Greg asked me one more time, giving me an ultimatum. I guess he'd had enough. There's a party, and I want us to go together. And if you say no this time, I'm just going to have to take someone else. Look at it this way, he argued. One less weekend to spend at home with your mother. I want to be with you. Can't you see that? And I'll make nice to my father and get the Grand Prix. That time, I gave no excuses. I just stood there, voiceless. He smiled broadly. Great. I'm going to take your silence as a yes, babe. You'll see. We'll have a great time. And we did. We danced and drank a lot of beer, and after the party, we parked on the dead-end street near my old elementary school. I'm sorry it took me so long to say yes, but there was a guy in high school, and he messed with my head. I explained, and I told him about Tommy. Thanks for trusting me, Greg said, and if I ever meet that guy, I'm going to beat the shit out of him. Then he leaned in and kissed me. Did I ever tell you about this car? He whispered, as he fumbled with the zipper of my parka, slipping his cold fingers beneath my sweater. That your father promised to give it to you when you graduate, I said, barely managing to find the words. Yes, and that the seats go down. My first meeting with the Hoffmans, Ron and Eloise, wasn't so much a dinner invitation as it was a demand, one his father wouldn't let up on until we both agreed. The Hoffmans lived in a 2-family attached house on the service road of the Long Island Expressway. Rumor had it that a woman's body had been found in the soft shoulder underneath the underbrush across the way. The Hoffmans' apartment was a short flight of stairs up. The air was thick with cooking smells, a roast, I thought, and the windows were covered in condensation. Mom, we're here, Greg yelled. Okay, 20 minutes, his mother yelled back from the kitchen. I'll see you then. I'm too busy now. Well, I guess that means I'll be introducing you at dinner, Greg said as we walked past the living room, a gaudy affair with plastic-encased white brocade couch and chairs. In the corner, porcelain tchotchkes filled a golden hands display case. Dancing ladies on point, men and women in Louis XIV dresses, and little forest animals, and a mirror with elaborate flower designs etched into the glass. Let's go to my room till someone says something. The table is set for 4, so I guess that means Sunny is going out. Sunny was Greg's older sister, and just as we made ourselves comfortable in his room, the door slammed open, and a voluptuous blonde, having little success holding together the black dress she was falling out of, came storming into the room. "Knock next time, will you, Sonny? Can I borrow your date for a minute? I need someone to sew me into this dress." Then she handed me a needle and black thread. "Be a sweetheart," she said, rounding her back so I could begin sewing. Sonny's enormous blue eyes were fringed with false eyelashes, and a curly blonde hairpiece was pinned to the top of her short blonde hair. "I didn't want to bother Mom. She's in the kitchen sweating over the stove for the banquet she's preparing, and I'm sure you can do this. Right, hon?" When I finished, she looked like a life-size Cupid doll. Moments later, the downstairs bell rang. "Shit, gotta go. Thanks, hon." When we were called for dinner, Ron Huffman was sitting at the head of the table. "So this is who's been taking up all your time," he said, munching on a celery stalk. "Cora, this is Dad." "What do you think of my new suit?" he asked, puffing out his massive chest. Greg had promised we could eat and leave quickly, catch a movie or something. But when his father began to speak, I knew it was Ron who was in control of the situation. "Size 46 jackets, just like Bob Mitchum. Have to have them custom made." And then he screamed, "Eloise, where's the food?" Greg's mother hurried in then, plump knees bulging over white patent leather boots, wearing a short red-striped miniskirt. She placed a platter of roast beef in front of Ron, who poked and sniffed at it like a wild boar. "You always say the food is ready when it's not, Eloise, and the meat's going to be overcooked." She hurried back to the kitchen, and I was halfway off the chair. "Let me help, Mrs. Hoffman." Ron put out his arm. "Sit. She can do it herself." "So you're Greg's girlfriend. Are you wasting your education learning to paint, too?" Before I could answer, Eloise came rushing back to the table with a bottle of Budweiser. "You burnt the carrots." She hadn't. "And there's not enough Earl on the salad," he said. Just like that, he said it. Earl. "Do you know where I was born?" "Hoboken. Just like old Blue Eyes." "Eloise, I want another beer. This one's warm. And what the hell happened to your hair?" I held my breath and looked up at Greg's mother. I could imagine her hair once had perfectly formed platinum curls, but the strands of her hair had become limp and were sticking to her forehead like albino leeches that needed to be wiped away. "This is what I pay good money for?" Ryan ranted, pointing his finger at her head. Eloise sank into her chair in tears, cowed like a whipped dog. "Leave her alone, Dad," Greg said, gripping me beneath the table, his anger forging his fingertips into my thigh. "You made her cry. Isn't that enough?" Eloise ran from the room, and Ron turned to Greg, sucking his teeth like a snarling dog, baring his gums. "You think you're a real man, but you'll never be the man I am. I'm fed up with you wasting money on art supplies. Get a job." I should have run and not turned back from that dinner, but of course I didn't. And soon Greg and I were talking about finding an apartment together. At the same time, the unthinkable was happening. Rachel and I were drifting apart. Outwardly we fought about her drug use, but I was secretly envy of her lifestyle. She was living in Manhattan with her boyfriend Gianni, 10 years his senior, and was taking a semester off to live with him in Italy. Greg wasn't into experimenting with alternative lifestyles, wouldn't even smoke a joint, and he was judgmental of those who did. But he seemed gentle and caring, always wanting to please me in and out of bed, and with Rachel gone, I needed him even more. When the arguments with his father intensified, Greg would spend weekends on our living room couch. Though my mother was flirtatious and inappropriate at times, walking around in a slip with a scarf tucked into her bra, something I'd seen her do with Uncle Solly, she seemed to be fond of Greg, and I thought leaving home with him would be acceptable to her. But I soon found out how wrong I'd been. "What are you, a hippie now?" she asked when I told her Greg and I would be living together. "What am I going to tell people? And what are you going to do about your grandmother? She's going to be put in the hospital." "Tell them we're in love and we want to be together. Because that's what two people who love each other do these days. They live together. It's not like when you were young, Mom. Nobody cares. You live here rent-free, and you have the run of the place. I don't bother you." My mother's voice had climbed a few octaves. "Do I? Well, do I? Mom, you make it sound like I have an entire wing of a mansion. This is all besides the point. I want to be with Greg. Do I have to spell it out?" "And what does that mean, spell it out? Nice girls wait for their wedding day." "I'm tired of hearing that old line from you. Everyone lives together these days. Marriage is so permanent. You know," she said, "his parents hold the secret, and the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree." She sounded as if she was gazing into a crystal ball. "Please stop talking in cliches. I thought you liked him. Stupid me. I thought you'd be thrilled that I found someone who loves me. I thought that was what you wanted for me." I do. Just not Greg. He's still so immature." It was true. Greg was young and unformed, as my mother had said. But he'd responded to me with a purpose others had never hinted at, and I'd fallen in love with him loving me, and the idea that we would leave home together.